Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie herzlich zu unserem heutigen Forumsabend und schaue in die Runde, ob hier überhaupt jemand ist, der des Deutschen nicht mächtig ist. Eigentlich jeder. Wir müssen uns jetzt fragen, ob wir auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch prozedieren. Sie sind im Englischen so zu Hause, dass Sie es vielleicht als Nachteil empfinden würden. Ich würde sagen, dem Prinzip der Verständlichkeit und Verstehbarkeit entsprechend mache ich jetzt mal einfach die Einführung auf Deutsch. Sind Sie einverstanden? Aber wir finden dann in die andere Sprache auch hinein. Ich habe aber auch eine besondere Begründung dafür. Mir ist nämlich vorhin etwas passiert, wovon Sie alle träumen, wenn Sie 2-3 Stunden am Gerät gesessen haben, um einen Text zu entwerfen und er Ihnen beim Speichern für immer entschwindet. Genau das ist mir vorhin passiert. Und selbst unsere Spezialisten in der Rekonstruktion solcher elementare Verluste konnten diesen Text nicht wiederfinden. Und das ist jetzt kein Fake, den ich erfinde, sondern es war tatsächlich so. Deswegen werde ich etwas freier darüber sprechen, dass wir heute über Women as Judges, Jurists and Legal Advisors in the Islamic Tradition sprechen werden. Sie werden sich fragen, warum soll das überhaupt ein Thema sein? Juristinnen, ist irgendwie was Besonderes, dass sie dann Richter werden, ist doch irgendwie normal. Sollten sie doch eigentlich, ist doch eigentlich so überall auf der Welt. Und so weiter. Bei uns war es 1922 in Deutschland, dass die erste Richterin ihr Amt angetreten hat. Der Bund Deutscher Richterinnen weiß davon, viele Geschichten einfach zu erzählen. Und das Narrativ ist endlos, auch wenn wir es über Deutschland hinaus ausbreiten. Und interessant sind die Argumente, die aufgeführt werden, die in unterschiedlichen Kontexten, auch im Islamischen, immer wieder auftauchen. Die prinzipielle Irrationalität der Frau, was natürlich mit der Aufgabe der Rechtsprechung und Rechtsfindung nicht vereinbar ist. Und dass sie sich möglicherweise durch Emotionen in der Entscheidungsfindung würde leiten lassen und von dort her für die hehre Aufgabe der Rechtsfindung nicht geeignet sei. Es ist denkbar, dass wir darüber nachher vielleicht auch noch mehr erfahren werden, denn the field of religious legal authority, you say, whether in Islam, Catholic and Eastern Christianity or Judaism, is still by and large a field that lacks gender diversity. Rarely are women accepted as interpreters of religious law, as prayers leaders in front of mixed congregations, or as religious leaders whose advice is sought beyond questions pertaining to the private sphere. Also, dass es jenseits dieser dann Frauen doch zugestandenen Kompetenzbereiche auch eine juristische Urteilskraft für Frauen geben könnte. Wir haben das in Bezug auf Lady Judges, wie es Livia Holden in ihrem doch spannenden Film einmal uns vorgeführt hat, im Jahre 2014 erlebt, nämlich auf Pakistan bezogen. Und das war auch am Beispiel des islamischen Kontexts auf eine ungemein spannende Art und Weise uns dargebracht und vorgeführt, sodass wir mit der Thematik hier im Hause nicht völlig unvertraut sind. Frau Künkler hat politische Wissenschaft, African Studies, Oriental Studies, also Orientwissenschaften, was das auch immer genau im Deutschen jetzt sein soll, und auch Wirtschaftswissenschaften an den Universitäten Leipzig, Paris, Cape Town studiert. Und dann gibt es einen kleinen Sprung. Wir sind nämlich schon bei der Dissertation an der Columbia University mit einer Dissertation über das Thema Demokratisierung, Islamic Thought and Social Movements, Coalitional Success and Failure in Iran and Indonesia. Und das heißt, dass wir hier übrigens unter der Betreuung von Charles Tilly, Alfred Stepan and Said Arjemand. Das ist natürlich eine wunderbare Zusammenstellung für eine solche Thematik und gibt aber auch schon die Richtung eines besonderen Forschungsinteresses vor, das mit dem Iran doch in besonderer Art und Weise verbunden ist. Anschließend hat sich Mirjam Künkler mit auf den Nahen Osten bezogenen Studien an der Princeton University befasst, 9 Jahre lang immerhin. Und dort hat sie zwei wichtige Forschungsvorhaben betreut, nämlich einmal Traditional Authority and Transnational Religious Networks in Contemporary Shia Islam und co-directed ein Loose Program on Religion and International Affairs, das jeweils Fellow, Workshops, Studentenaustausch beinhaltete und von dort her eine sehr, sehr spannende Dynamik und sehr sichtbare Dynamik entfaltet hat. Das hat sich in gewisser Weise fortgesetzt in einem mit dem Kollegen Merzat Barujerdi entwickelten Iran Social Science Data Portal fortgesetzt, von dem Sie mir auch die Zahlen mitgeteilt haben. Sie sind eindrucksvoll, nämlich das sind 3000 Besucher und 7000 angeklickte Seiten pro Monat. Und jetzt habe ich dann nochmal nachgeguckt, was wir auch so aufweisen können. Das sieht nicht so richtig schlechter aus, sondern es ist vielleicht noch ein bisschen mehr, aber wir haben die Doppelklicks auch nicht ausgefiltert, die Sie wahrscheinlich dabei berücksichtigt haben. Also ein sehr wichtiges Forschungsprogramm. Und als ich Mirjam Künkler gefragt habe, was ist Ihnen denn eigentlich wichtig bei der Vorstellung? Die Bücher, die Sie alle verfasst haben und wen Sie alles mit Ihren Vorträgen in der Welt beeindruckt haben. Da hat sie gesagt, ja, das ist alles sehr wichtig, aber es geht auch um meine Studierenden, meine Doktoranden, die viele Preise gewonnen haben und das ist eine ganz, ganz lange Liste und das, glaube ich, sagt auch etwas über das Verständnis aus, Universitätslehrerin zu sein. Und zu einem Thema, das uns jetzt im Weiteren beschäftigen wird, zu dem Sie uns vertiefte Einblicke gewähren werden und wo ich Ihnen sehr, sehr gerne etwas aus der Publikationsliste noch vortragen würde, aber befürchte, dass ich Sie dermaßen langweile durch die Langatmigkeit des Vortrags, obwohl die Themen, um die es geht, dort außerordentlich faszinierend sind. Und wir werden dies alles in Ihrem Vortrag erfahren. Was mir wichtig erscheint, ist, dass hier vor dem Hintergrund der zuvor genannten Disziplinen, und das werden wir heute erfahren bei dem Vortrag über die Rolle von Richterinnen in der islamischen Rechtswelt sozusagen, dass überhaupt ein Blick auf das Recht gerichtet wird in den islamischen Zivilisationen, der vielfach, sei es den Islamwissenschaftlern ausschließlich oder den Juristen, die nur ein begrenztes Interesse am Islam aufbringen, deswegen verschlossen ist, weil die Berührungspunkte, die Conjectures and Refutations einfach nicht zusammenkommen. Und das scheint mir etwas Besonderes zu sein an dem, was Sie machen, sehr verehrte Mirjam Künkler. Und vielleicht ist es auch der Grund, warum wir Sie so gerne als Fellow an unser Center eingeladen haben, wo Sie nämlich schon inzwischen seit einiger Zeit tätig sind und dabei sind, ein wichtiges Buch abzuschließen, über das Sie uns vielleicht später noch erzählen werden. Jetzt aber haben Sie endlich das Wort. Ich freue mich, dass Sie da sind. Und Sie sind jetzt völlig frei, die Sprache zu wählen, in der Sie sich jetzt am wohlsten fühlen.
Well, thank you. I speak English. I prepared the talk in English, but we could maybe have the discussion in German afterwards. I would like to thank very much the directors for the invitation to be here. It has really been a wonderful pleasure to spend several months already at the center with very, very impressive and inspiring talks and conferences. There are several fellows here tonight with whom we had fantastic discussions, and some of us are already involved in joint publication projects. And I'd also like to thank the staff, which has been extremely helpful in bibliographic research and all sorts of things whenever support was needed. Now, today is a rather unusual topic, I think, for the Center Law as Culture. It really deals more with topics from the field of Islamic studies. And in light of that, in particular, I would like to thank the attendees for your interest. Several, I know, are battling with the flu and have come nevertheless, and also the weather is very inhospitable outside, so really thank you for making it here tonight. I will start with a lady to who I would like to draw your attention. Her name is Nusrat Amin. She's Iranian from the city of Isfahan, but hardly anybody knows her by the name of Nusrat Amin. Everybody knows her by the name of Banu Isfahani, the lady from Isfahan. And why is she known as Banu Isfahani, as the lady from Isfahan? She shows up in the bibliographic catalogs this way, so if you find her name, you could think it could be any lady from Isfahan. Do we know whether all these works that are authored by her stem back to the same person, or could it be several? Why she's so special is she is the most outstanding Islamic scholar of the 20th century in Islamic law, you can say, and she's the only woman of whom we know until today that she authored an entire Quranic commentary. So many scholars are known to comment on particular parts of the Quran, on this verse or that verse, but she's somebody who has written a commentary on the entirety of the Quran, and she published this over a period of 15 to 20 years in a 15-volume work. So it's 15 Persian volumes, where she, in every chapter, takes one of the Quranic verses and interprets them in light of usually theological and legal questions. And you may already wonder, well, why do we start a talk about women judges and jurists and legal advisors with a woman who's really a scholar of Islam? And you might think of her as mostly a theologian, because if you come from a Christian tradition, that's usually what you think of as sort of scholars of religion tend to be theologians. But really in Islam, what matters if you emerge as an authority, if you want to establish yourself as an authority, is the ability to interpret Islamic law. And you study the sources of law, that is the Quran and the Hadith. We will come back to these terms in a moment. The Hadith are the sayings of the Prophet. You study these as theologians will, but you study them in order to be able to interpret Islamic law and in order to be able to respond to questions from believers about how they should behave. So to be an outstanding authority means to be an outstanding, to have outstanding expertise really in Islamic law, and that is why this woman is quite extraordinary. So she's somebody who could have issued fatwas. Again, these are sort of statements, legal recommendations on a particular question that an inquirer might level against her. And these fatwas could then be invoked either by courts, so judges could take up these fatwas in order to justify their ruling, and they could also be taken up in parliamentary processes in order to reform the law. You do that with reference to fatwas in order to justify why a new position should be accepted. Now, I came across this woman in a book that a colleague of mine from Princeton had authored. It's Michael Cook, a great scholar of early Islam and Islamic law, and he's the author of the Oxford Brief Introduction to the Quran. You may all know one or the other books in this big series, Brief Introductions into some topic. He's the one who has authored the one on the Quran. And I read it in preparation of a class I was teaching, and I came across this sentence where he says, well, there's this one lady, Banu Isfahani, who has authored an entire tafsir. And I thought, oh, this is really unusual. I've never heard of a woman authoring an entire tafsir. And I spoke to other colleagues, and I called some friends and wrote emails, and I asked everybody, are you aware? So she's from Iran, but scholars who work on Senegal, Indonesia, Jordan, Morocco, Algeria. I asked them, have you ever heard of a woman authoring an entire tafsir? And everybody said no, and it's impossible. Actually, don't believe she really existed. And so I went to speak to Michael Cook, and I said, I would really love to know more about her. You say she's Iranian, I work on Iran. Maybe next time I do my fieldwork, I could go and see if I find any of her students, or I can try to get access to her books. And he said, well, the sentence in the introduction to the Quran is really all I know about her. I only know her name is Banu Isfahani, and she wrote an entire tafsir on the Quran. So if you go to Iran, I would really love to hear what you find out, because I don't know anything else. And that was really the beginning of a whole research interest of mine. This was, I think it happened around 2008. And so the next summer I went to Iran. I went to Isfahan, and I tried to find the school where she taught, and I tried to find people who had studied under her. And I also collected some of her books. To my surprise, the Princeton Library actually had her tafsir. So the whole 15-volume tafsir in Persian was there. It was published in the early 80s. Originally, it was published in the 60s, but that publication, that edition, was from the early 80s. And I opened it and thought, oh, how wonderful that this tafsir is available here in the library. And I looked into the different stamps, and I realized nobody had ever taken it out. There was not a single stamp. And you must imagine that this is such a singular occurrence. The only woman who ever interpreted the entire Quran and wrote down her interpretation. And it's a really large field in Islamic studies. I mean, there are dozens and dozens, and I mean, hundreds of scholars whose main expertise is in tafsir studies. And it's quite shocking then if you realize there is one woman who has written an entire tafsir and nobody ever has consulted it and has written about her. So I started to research her and published an article with a friend of mine, an Iranian colleague, about some of her works and her life, where she studied, the schools that she opened. And that really brought us to look more into the issue of women's religious authority in Islam, mostly in the 19th and 20th century. And we realized that, well, there are case studies here and there of women who have transmitted hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. There are women who are sometimes mentioned as teachers in Islamic law, but there really is no comprehensive work that tells us something about the type of authority that women exercised in the history of Islam. You find case studies, but you really find no work of an overview, and certainly no attempt to somehow understand why are sometimes women more prevalent as religious authorities in a particular context, in a particular century, in a particular place, and why not in others. So there really is no research program yet that tries to sort of systematize these different case studies that we have. And in a way, that is what a colleague and I now try to do, and part of what I will talk about today is are parts of a book that I'm publishing with Devin Stewart, who is a professor of Islamic studies at Emory University. We are publishing a book this year that's coming out with Edinburgh University Press that only looks at the Shi'i world. I will talk here both about the Shi'i and the Sunni world. In that book, we just limit ourselves to the Shi'i world because there's already a lot we want to cover. And who knows, maybe in a few years, either we or some other scholars can try to do something for the Sunni world. So necessarily this talk will be a little bit encyclopedic because I give you impressions from Islamic law and examples of women who have exercised religious authority. I apologize that it is a little bit encyclopedic for that reason. It's really sort of an outline of a research program, some of which now have been tackled by some of my students and other colleague students, but a lot of which is still to be tackled in the future. And I also thought that I will use slides, which I don't really like to do when I speak a lot. I just like to use slides when I give numbers and statistics. But in this case, I will also provide you with a lot of names, and I thought it's easier. Many of them are in Arabic, are from different places in the Muslim world. Rather than me just mentioning all of these different places and names, and you sort of thinking, well, where are we now? Are we in Cairo or Nishapur? I put them on a slide so at least you can follow them a little bit. And maybe the younger scholars who are here can think about whether they are interested in turning their attention to some of these women, or talking to their fellow students in Islamic studies and elsewhere, where there is really a great gold mine to still dig. And I just want to mention in a side note, it's, I think, quite, for the younger scholars here, it's quite difficult, I think, today to be really original in the social sciences, because most people work on some issues that relate to Western societies, and it's wonderful you can relate already to a lot of secondary work that has been done. But once you go into area studies and Islamic studies, you really realize how many black spots there are, especially in Islamic studies, how many manuscripts that are yet uncovered, not really analyzed. We don't know much about their context. Just last week I came across a woman Qadiya from Andalusia, so an Islamic female judge who worked in Cordoba that nobody has worked about until today. And there are really great resources to be original and to contribute a lot to new scholarship. So it's a call. If you are interested in these issues, or if you have friends who are, I would be very happy to talk more with you about it and guide you to some sources that are to be mined, and I think where you can really make a great impact on future research. So I will talk about women in today's judiciaries, about women jurists in the Islamic tradition, about the idea in the schools of law, in the Islamic schools of law, about the type of authority that women can and should not have, and about women in today's Islamic judiciaries. So 4 broad themes. This is a representation, I hope you can see it also from the back, of some impressions about women's involvement in judicial systems. So we have South Asia here, right? India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia and the Pacific, China, Korea, Japan, but even Australia is part of the Pacific here in this UN category, Latin America and the Caribbean, Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia and the world. And this measures female lawyers and judges in these countries' judiciaries. So you see that the world average is somehow around 27%. About 20. This doesn't distinguish whether these women are at the lowest level of the judiciary or the highest. It's just a general number from UN Women pertaining to 2012. So the world's average is somehow around 27%. Surprisingly, you see that Middle East and North Africa is nearly the world average, around 25%. It really outperforms women's involvement in the judiciary in East Asia. I think it's quite surprising. China, Korea, Japan have much lower numbers of women's involvement in the judiciary, and also it much outperforms South Asia. So the Middle East and North Africa, all Muslim countries except for Israel, here show quite a medium trend compared to the world, very close to the world average. We can also see, I came from a conference in Beirut last weekend where we actually talked to some extent also about women's involvement in the judiciary. So while women's participation is still quite low, if you look at parliaments, of course if you look at the percentage of women in the workforce, in the Middle East and North Africa, judiciaries are really a channel now where women are on the rise. So already in the late 2000s, you see that a number of Arab countries start to appoint women to quite high judicial positions. The Supreme Judicial Council of Egypt appointed 30 female judges in 2007. Jordan in that year appointed its first female chief justice. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is still a little bit lagging behind. It just appointed its first female judge, so not talking about the highest level, the chief justice, but the first female judge. Yemen at that time, pre-war period, also appointed its first female judge to the Supreme Court. In the Gaza and the West Bank, you actually have quite a high number. 16% of lawyers and 10% of judges are employed, women in the judiciary. In Morocco, 18% of judges, and in Lebanon, 37% of the judges and 29% of lawyers are women. If you compare that, for example, to Germany, you have 46% of judges in Germany who are women and 12% in the high courts. So women are really on the rise, and the numbers are increasing. The judiciary, again, is one of the channels, other than the regular workforce, where women are increasingly employed. But this talk will actually not be about these judiciaries. Why? Now, Montesquieu said, judges must be no more than the mouth that pronounces the words of the law, mere passive beings incapable of moderating either its force or rigor, right? And so the judge here is the executor of the law, if you will. He applies the codified law, and of course the judiciary has a clearly secondary role to the branches of the executive and the legislature. This is not the idea in courts applying Islamic law. That is not the idea at all, right? It is really the nightmare of an alim, of an Islamic scholar, to think that as a judge of Islamic law you would be merely applying something that is codified by the state. It is, if you will, the anathema. By contrast, if you pride yourself as being an authoritative judge of Islamic law, it really means you have to show your erudition, again, in the two sources of law that are most important, the Quran and the Hadith. You have to have undergone decades of training in different fields of Islamic sciences, and what really proves your authority is not that you are most informed about what law is codified, but that you are most expert in finding analogies or otherwise areas in which you can apply the Quran and the Hadith to contemporary situations, right? You are not the mouthpiece. By contrast, you are somebody who is supposed to apply your own individual reasoning. So it's a completely different philosophy of what the judge's role is from the French civil law type of judge. So this talk here is not about the women who come up in these statistics I showed you a moment ago, because those are about the judiciaries, the state judiciaries that apply state civil law. I will talk tonight about courts that apply Islamic law, and ideally non-codified Islamic law, right? So from this quote by Montesquieu, you can also already sort of sense the idea that the Islamic scholars, ulama, have been very, very resistant to the whole idea of codification, because it really takes away the imperative that you apply your own individual reasoning to the best ability to interpret the law. Now, to give you an idea of whether women fulfill these criteria, can women be masters of the Quran and the Hadith, and can women therefore be appointed as judges in a court applying Islamic law? As you may or may not know, in the Sunni world of Islam, there are 4 schools of law that are predominant. You have the Maliki school in North and West Africa. You have the Hanafi school that was applied in the Ottoman Empire and is still applied in many places that were part of the Ottoman Empire. So from Albania to Russia, you still find remnants of Hanafi law. You don't find it in Turkey, because Turkey is one of the few Muslim countries that entirely secularized its legal system. But in other former countries that were part of the Ottoman Empire, you still see Hanafi law applied in family law. So I've just mentioned the Maliki, the Hanafi school. You have the Hanbali school, which is predominant on the Arabian Peninsula. And you have the Shafi'i school that is predominant in South and Southeast Asia. So these are the 4 Sunni schools of law. And then you have also Shia schools of law. The 12er Shia school is the one that's predominant in Iran. You have other Shia schools that are predominant among the Shiites of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I will just speak about the 12er Shia school and these 4 major Sunni schools of law. And each one of them have different positions on whether women can be judges, whether women can interpret the law, and what kinds of law they have the authority to learn of and speak about. So what we're really concerned with are muftis and qadis. What is a mufti? A mufti is someone who is trained to issue a fatwa. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can issue a fatwa, you do it usually only as a response to the inquiry of a believer. A believer, a man or woman, can come to you and say, I would like to visit my relative. I just give you an example of the case of family law. I would like to, if you're a woman, I would like to visit my relatives. I actually did visit my relatives. My husband was not informed of my trip to my parents, but nevertheless, I think he should now pay for my trip to my parents, even though he didn't consent to it beforehand. What is your recommendation? Does he need to pay or not? Does he need to pay for my trip even though he wouldn't consent beforehand? That would be a typical inquiry. And then as a religious authority, you will issue a fatwa and say, under these and these conditions, he has to pay, he does not have to pay. Most people in this case would agree that he does not have to pay because he didn't consent to your journey. But that is a typical example of issuing a fatwa. And a fatwa really is not binding on the inquirer. So the inquirer can then go to another religious authority and ask for another fatwa if he or she doesn't like the outcome. You sort of have an idea of legal pluralism here. But the fatwa can also be very authoritative, depending on the person who has issued it. So if you're an outstanding religious scholar who is really widely revered, then many people will want to read about your fatwa and maybe judges will invoke it in their court rulings, and maybe parliamentarians will want to read it if it's prevalent to a case of legal reform that they are debating. So that is what a mufti does. A mufti issues a fatwa. A qadi is a judge in a court. And in some countries, a mufti will be more influential. In other countries, a qadi will be more influential. It really depends on the socio-legal context, if you will. In some societies, you have the idea that the qadi really should be an outstanding scholar himself, and therefore he will really sort of consider his own fatwas as most authoritative. In others, you have the idea that the qadi should consult very widely with the existing fatwas and make a decision based on that. So in some societies, muftis will be more authoritative, in others, qadis. What do the schools of jurisprudence say about whether women can fulfill either of these positions? Now, most Sunni and Shia schools of jurisprudence recognize the eligibility of women to serve as muftis, which is really quite extraordinary. Many societies today do not recognize that. It was quite a surprise to many of my colleagues, and also many of the colleagues in Indonesia or Iran that I converse with, that according to their schools of law, women can actually be muftis. Women are recognized as authoritative enough to issue fatwas if they are trained to do so. And this is not only with regard to issues of particular relevance or interest to women, usually child rearing, hygiene, domestic issues, but really with regard to any issues. It's quite extraordinary. If you are interested in issues of Islamic law, there's really a very, very large field of scholarship to mine, because a lot of people do not realize that women can be muftis with regard to all matters. And most societies do not recognize women today as muftis that can judge or that can issue fatwas in all matters. What do they say about qadis? Now, the Hanafi school, again, that's the school that was predominant in the Ottoman Empire, says that women can give testimony, and therefore they can also be qadis in most cases, but not in issues of criminal law. So these are sort of hudud and qisas are particular areas of Islamic criminal law, and here it is believed that women cannot function as judges. Hudud usually applies to, you may or may not know the hudud punishments, cutting off the hands of a thief, stoning in the case of adultery. These are crimes that are only recognized as such crimes in very few Islamic countries, and with regard to all criminal law cases, it's always only men who are recognized as authoritative enough to function as qadis there. But the Hanafi school allows women to be qadis in all other matters. The Maliki, the Hanbali, and the Shafi school do not allow women to be qadis, but nevertheless you have minority opinions in all of these schools that actually do allow for women to exercise these. For those of you here who have an Islamic studies background, Al-Tabari is widely regarded as a major towering Islamic scholar, stands out as somebody in the history of Islamic thought who did believe that women can be judges in all matters. So even he went beyond the Hanafi school. He said women can even, over hadud and qisas, they could exercise juristic authority. There are also minority schools. There are Zahiris who actually recognize female judgeship. So we have sort of a dominant picture in the major schools of law that do not allow it, or allow it only in exceptional circumstances, but we also have minority opinions and minority schools that do recognize it. Never mind these theoretical considerations, we actually are not aware in the history of Islamic courts of any woman ever functioning as a qadi until the 20th century. So at some point there was a celebrated case of somebody called Tumal in the Ottoman Empire, but scholars then who looked further into what kind of law she actually applied, she was a judge in a mazalim court, which meant she applied administrative state law, and she was not a judge over Islamic law. Now, interestingly, there are what are the reservations against women functioning as qadis? Well, they're usually one of two types. There, of course, is the argument that women do not showcase or feature sufficient aql, sufficient reason, which is also something that you find as a widely accepted argument in Western societies, right, until the 20th century, that women are too emotional, too unreliable. Within the month they have the ups and downs. You cannot really rely on their stability as judges in court. So they are not fit to exert their reasoning to the law. That's the reasoning-related reservation. You have also another reservation that says women cannot exert public authority over a man, right? And in a courtroom, necessarily, they would have to function as a judge over a possibly male litigant, which means they would have to exercise their authority. And that is considered anathema with regard to certain hadith, with regard to certain sayings of the Prophet. And these hadith are also invoked when discussions turn around the question, can women be political leaders, can they be presidents, and so on. We know, of course, that many Muslim societies today do have political leaders, presidents, prime ministers, ministers in different functions, but nevertheless, these hadith are still often invoked to justify the exclusion of women from the position of a qadi. Now, interestingly enough, as a colleague of mine, Karen Bauer from the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London has shown, there are scholars in the Islamic tradition who do accept women to be muftis in all matters. So obviously these women must have sufficient aql, sufficient reasoning to issue a fatwa, but still they do not believe they have sufficient aql to function as qadis. So you do find quite, sometimes inconsistent positions on whether women are rational enough or not in the same scholars with regard to different questions. Now, I will talk about Iran also later, and I do want to highlight the position of two scholars, because Iran, of course, is a particular case where we have this idea that women are widely excluded from positions in public life. There are only 9 of 290 parliamentarians. After the revolution, women were excluded from judgeship and only very slowly could regain their place as at least prominent lawyers. But there are, even in Iran, minority positions that do argue that women can be judges in court. You may or may not have come across this name Sani, a mujtahid, a great Ayatollah who was demoted because he took part in the Green Movement in 2009, the Reform Movement. He is somebody who argues that both urf so both custom and reason do not distinguish between the role of female and male judges in Islamic law. This is the Shafi, the 12 Shi'i school. Women are acceptable to function as judges. And you find a similar position among Ayatollah Bujnodi, who is a very influential Ayatollah in Iran, who also argues that women can be judges. And these arguments are open in public, and they're invoked by students in the religious seminaries. So many people are informed about these dissident opinions, if you will, with regard to the question. But until today, they have not translated into public policy. Now, I want to highlight some of these scholars in the Islamic tradition who have been great, outstanding teachers and jurists. I will probably jump over some of them. I don't want to give you too many names. It's maybe very interesting for someone from an Islamic studies background, but not for everybody. Just to give you as an idea, as a sort of structuring idea of what it means to exert religious authority, you find that it concentrates around 3 issue areas: transmitting hadith, transmitting the sayings of the Prophet. This is very important because they are part of the source material, right? The Quran and the hadith. And so it's very, very important that hadith are only transmitted through transmitters that are considered to be sound, reliable. And surprisingly, we do find in these chains of transmitters very often numerous women who obviously therefore were considered sound and reliable enough in their societies to carry the tradition forward, if you will, right? Because these are orally transmitted sayings. The second is the issuing of fatwas. I already talked about it. And the third is judging in court. So with regard to the transmission of hadith, those who transmit hadith are called muhadithat. You find women among all these 3 areas most present in this particular area. So there's really now, so you can say from the 1960s until today, it has been widely accepted that yes, women are a very substantial part in the Islamic tradition as transmitters of hadith. You find them in various isnad, various chains of transmission, and there's really no question that women were considered as reliable and as sound as men as transmitters of hadith. But it's also, again, quite a recent insight, right? From the 1960s until today. It's not so old that this was widely accepted. Ignaz Goldziher, one of the early formative figures in Islamic studies, already studied this quite early. So the musnidas is another term for muhadithat, are common up until the 16th century, common era, and this title occurs very frequently in the list of authentications in manuscript and in ijazas. And ijazas are permissions. An ijaza is a permission that a teacher will give to his students saying, you are allowed to transmit such and such field of Islamic science, and perhaps even I give you permission and I give you certification that you are sufficiently trained to write about a particular area of Islamic law. So women are prevalent here as those who give ijazas. In a very recent work, a scholar from Oxford, Muhammad Akram Nadwi, he has written a multi-companion work on these al-muhadithat. He writes that in the formative period of Islam, the period of the companions and successors of the Prophet, women scholars are not only great in number, but also great in prominence, great in their authority. Men go to them to learn, and doing so is normal. I really cannot stress this enough, because if I give a talk like this in Indonesia or Iran, you will find 90% of the audience that disagrees and just believes that this cannot be true. It's not part of local curricula. It's also not part of the oral history, and therefore there's often really a denial that women were outstanding figures in the tradition in terms of transmitting both hadith and scholarly works on Islamic law. Just to mention a few sources from a variety of geographic contexts. These are great hadith scholars, major sources that have authored bibliographic dictionaries. What you will do if you are interested in finding out about the great Islamic scholars in early and medieval Islam is you would first consult the bibliographic dictionaries that give you short entries of particular people, where they worked, where they studied, who their teachers were, who their students were. And some of the most important sources to find about what these muhadithat are in these bibliographic dictionaries. Now, you can just see here some of the great scholars in the Islamic tradition list among their own teachers, women. Ibn Hajar studied, he lists 170 prominent women. I mean, very, very, very sizable. As-Sakhawi has a multi-12-volume work on scholars, and he has dedicated one entire volume to female scholars. There's also Al-Dhahabi, about whom another fellow who was here, Irene Schneider, has worked quite intensively. He has written about 93 women who were outstanding teachers and transmitters. There are a number of great figures in the Islamic tradition who list among their authoritative teachers women, and often also would travel to these cities in order to study with women. So you find a scholar from Cairo who will travel to Nishapur because there's a particular woman with whom he wants to study for 2 years or so. So these are really extraordinary mobile networks where female scholars draw crowds of students just like male scholars do, and not at all an exceptional or unusual impression. I want to highlight one case, and this is again something that Irene Schneider has really written about very interestingly. She's a professor of Islamic law at the University of Göttingen, and she was a fellow here 2 years ago. In most accounts of women teaching their students, we find that they would either do so from behind a curtain. They would do it openly to female students, but from behind a curtain to male students. Or they would sort of be in an enclosed room, and the male students would be sitting outside of that room and listen to the woman, but not be able to see her. Irene Schneider has come across some women in the, what is today the Iranian realm of learning, where we have accounts of women teachers and male students apparently sitting next to each other. So there's one story of a scholar from Nishapur who writes down, I learned this text with my female teacher and I didn't understand a clause, and I bent over and showed her the book, and she bent down and explained it to me. They were sitting next to each other, they were looking at the same book, apparently there was great physical proximity between them, and it's not at all unusual. Now, these are the type of comparative insights that Devin Stewart, this colleague with whom I'm publishing the book, and I are really interested in. Right? You find a very, very different sociocultural context here in Iranian lands, where not only in modernity, before the revolution, but also apparently in medieval Islam, you find occurrences where men and women would sit next to each other and learn together, and men would learn from women while actually being able to see them and even have very close physical proximity. So it's very astounding, but until today you don't find any comparative sort of observations about this, because you just have some scholars working on the situation in Cairo, others on the situation in Nishapur, with very sort of little context and comparison between them. Finally, I want to highlight the issue of female jurists, and many of you may or may not know this name of Khaled Abu al-Fadl, a great scholar of Islamic law at the University of California in Los Angeles, who is really someone who tries to pioneer the study of female jurists in the early Islamic tradition. And he has already gathered quite a few students around him who start to look into their manuscripts, but it still also here is a field of scholarship that is just in its beginning. So he writes that certain families from Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad made a virtual tradition of training female transmitters and narrators. These female scholars regularly trained and certified male and female jurists. So again, you have women certifying male jurists, and therefore played a major contributing role in the preservation and transmission of Islamic traditions. And elsewhere he observes, in addition to the preservation and transmission of traditions, a careful reading of biographical dictionaries reveals a large number of women who are described as jurists, as faqihat, experts in Islamic law, and who are asserted to have attained a level of competence that qualified them to issue fatwas. Again, it's so important to highlight here that women were trained to issue fatwas, because there still is a wide perception today that women issuing fatwas is just not allowed in Islamic law, and it doesn't exist in Islamic history. And just now Islamic scholars are starting to dig up these manuscripts that show us otherwise. Now, what's the situation in the 20th century? As some of you may know who were here during the conference in November, what Islamic law is and means, I talked about it at that time in the context of constitutional law. What Islamic law is very, very different from country to country and society to society, right? So you have 53 Muslim majority countries, only 6 of them describe themselves as Islamic states, and only 6 of them actually base their constitutional law on Islamic law. In all other countries, you either have no Islamic law at all, such as in Turkey or the Central Asian republics that have inherited this secularist legacy from the Soviet time, or in the majority of cases, you only have Islamic law relegated to the realm of family law, right? So that's a majority situation, that Islamic law is prevalent only in the realm of family law. Very, very rarely is Islamic law the basis for public law, constitutional law, administrative law. So the majority of Muslim countries have Islamic law in the case of family law, and probably we would find about 35 or 40 who fall into this category. And we have 6 until today that allow women to function in the courts that apply this Islamic law. So the first country to do so was one of the 2 countries I work on, Indonesia, that in 1964 allowed women to become judges in Islamic courts. How did it come about? The Minister of Religion at that time, it's a society where the religious field is highly regulated by the state. You have a Ministry of Religion that is responsible for Islamic law, for issues of halal food certification, for Islamic finance. All of that is regulated by the state. The Minister of Religion in the 1960s had women in his family who were interested in Islamic law and trained in Islamic law, and he faced the situation that there really was a shortage of judges to serve in Islamic courts. So the country was just building up a state judiciary. Beforehand you had sort of diversified, decentralized systems of dealing with legal cases on the local level. From 1945 onwards, the Indonesian state started to build up a modern judiciary. In the beginning, state elites weren't even sure yet whether they want to have Islamic courts at all or not. There were some who said we should just have secular law for everybody, as you have in many of the former French colonies. But in the end, they decided, well, we do want to allow people. It's such a diverse archipelago. We have very, very different ideas of what law means. Legal pluralism, as you may know, is really an intrinsic legacy of the Indonesian legal system. So Islamic law was accepted, and Islamic courts were then formally integrated into the state judiciary. And the problem was that the state had great problems in recruiting judges on a general level. In the secular judiciary, which was considered to be more important, the criminal cases dealt with in the general courts, of course, the administrative and commercial cases. Family courts were looked down upon a little bit because these are sort of private matters. So he decided, well, we do allow women to become judges in our secular courts, in our general courts, and we really have a shortage of judges in our courts. We should allow women to be able to train and to be appointed. And interestingly, as I mentioned in November with my very different case of Islamic law and constitutional law in Iran, a similar Islamic concept was invoked, darura. Darura meaning necessity or legal emergency. He didn't argue that the Shafi school that is predominant in Indonesia recognizes women as judges in Islamic law, because it doesn't. Instead he said, well, we do have this legal tradition, but we really are facing a case here of emergency, and that should justify the appointment of women as judges in the Islamic courts. And he was quite shrewd about it. He first only allowed for this to happen in the district of Central Java where he is from, so he knew that he would face quite little resistance because his family is there, he has a lot of stature in the local community. Then he slowly expanded this to other districts in Central Java, then to all of Java, and over a longer period in 1989 it was then expanded to the entire national level. So it's a really outstanding program. It was pioneering. Indonesia was the first country to do so, and until today it's the country that has most judges, women judges, in the Islamic courts applying Islamic law. Sudan is an interesting case because it stands quite alone on the African continent in this regard. It also appointed a first woman into an Islamic court in 1971. Today you have about 10% of women who apply Islamic law in the Islamic courts. In Indonesia it's about 30%. And then you have a few countries and territories that more recently have embarked on a similar policy. Malaysia, no doubt, impacted through the program in neighboring Indonesia, started to appoint women judges in Kuala Lumpur in 2010. They're still quite rare, and actually there are still voices that say, well, they shouldn't be able to deal with divorce cases. It's important that men deal with divorce cases, not women judges. So the program is still a little bit in its infancy, if you will. In Malaysia, it's not well institutionalized yet. But the West Bank appointed 3 judges in Ramallah and Hebron, and that really is a case that makes a lot of headway now in the Middle East. Again, Irene Schneider is somebody who has worked on that, and she has gone to the West Bank and interviewed these judges. She's writing a book about them now, very interestingly. And a former student of mine has now written about the first judge who has been appointed to an Islamic court in Israel. Israel has also communal courts, right, where every religious group has the ability to apply its own family law. And the first Qadiyya, the first female judge, has been appointed in an Islamic court in Israel, which, as I spoke about to some of the fellows here earlier, is controversial because now you also have Jews making the argument that Jewish women should be appointed in the Jewish courts, which raises a lot of resistance among the rabbinical establishment. So Indonesia and Sudan as 2 countries that early on pioneered these programs, and a few countries that are now also expanding it to the Islamic judiciary in the Middle East and in Malaysia. And interestingly enough, again, the justification of these programs usually with reference to emergency or exigency, not because it is today accepted that women actually do have either sufficient reasoning or are allowed to exert public authority over men. That is still not officially accepted in these schools of law. Then I will actually still speak about these women scholars of Iran I wanted to speak about, if I still have the time. So to come back to Iran, where you do not have women judges since the revolution in 1979, right? Women were very prevalent in the judiciary before the revolution. You all will know Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who actually was the first appointed head judge in Tehran. She had to give up her position like many other female judges after the revolution. You don't have female judges today, but interestingly, I would argue you have the really most outstanding juristic scholars, women juristic scholars in the Muslim world today in Iran, which has a lot to do with the infrastructure of learning that is very sophisticated, that is also among certain social strata highly accepted. The Hausa system, the Shiite seminary system in Iran, has sort of a very, very distinguished and differentiated course of study where you have to undergo 3 cycles that each last 4 to 5 years. And after Ayatollah Khomeini, it has become quite a sort of attractive career track for women to go into these Shiite seminaries and try to attain expertise in jurisprudence. So I want to just highlight two of these. I've already drawn your attention to Nusrat Amin, and her authority is still unprecedented and unsurpassed until today. Even in Iran, you don't find women who have issued a tafsir today, an entire Quranic commentary, and also you don't find women who have been accepted by so many male scholars as an authoritative teacher, right? You have some women today where male scholars will say, yes, she was also my teacher, but for Nusrat Amin, it was really a badge of distinguishment to be taught by her. So she was a mujtahida. In the Iranian context, mujtahid is somebody who is trained to exert ijtihad, so to exert independent legal reasoning to the sources. Many people will not even know the term mujtahida because they only know the male version, mujtahid. All ayatollahs are mujtahids. You have to be a mujtahid in order to rise in the clerical hierarchy. But we actually know about a number of mujtahidas, and some of my students are now studying about these mujtahidas and writing their dissertations about them. So Nusrat Amin is somebody who authored jurisprudential treatises during her time, not only the tafsir but also jurisprudential works. She authored and granted ijazas to a number of scholars of ijtihad. She trained them to apply their own ijtihad. Even somebody such as Grand Ayatollah Burujerdi, who is considered to be the most outstanding Grand Ayatollah until the 1960s in the Shi'i world, recognized her authority and invoked her in some of his writings. I will not talk about her works. That's, I think, more interesting for somebody from an Iranian studies or Islamic studies background, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that she did also train women through schools that she founded. So the 1960s is an environment and a context in which the Iranian Shah introduced co-educational schooling and tried to replace all religious schooling by secular schooling. That was the mode of the time, secularization, modernization. She surprisingly went against this trend by establishing all girls' schools, and not secular but religious schools. She really wanted to make sure that girls are trained in the Quran and the Hadith. And surprisingly, she received permissions to do so. It was very difficult in the 1960s to open a religious school, but she was quite established in Isfahan and was able, after much petitioning, it took her several years, to convince the local administrators to grant her a license to open these schools. So she opened all-girls Islamic high schools. She trained a number of women who then also became mujtahids. And the generation that came after her and that was trained by her is the generation that then lobbied Ayatollah Khomeini to open the Hausa education, the Shia religious seminary education, to women. So in many ways, the fact that you see today many women in Iran going through the Shia seminaries is due to the legacy that she founded in the 1960s. It's due to her students who lived in the 1980s, this was already during the end of her life, and lobbied Ayatollah Khomeini to also open the Shia seminaries to women. One of the most important sort of disciples of her is Zohre Sefati. She is also someone who is a mujtahida, and some people would refer to her as a female ayatollah. She has also granted ijazas to male scholars. Interestingly, she was considered as a candidate to the clerical council that selects the supreme leader in Iran, so she also has a political figure. Again, in November, I talked about the fact that the supreme leader in Iran is officially elected actually by a council of 86 Islamic scholars. She was considered as a candidate for that, which underscores once again that to be male is not a requirement for many of the positions in the Iranian political system, right? Generally, women are allowed to run for them, but sociologically, they often are either not elected or they decide not to run, or they are disqualified by the Council of Guardians. But theoretically, it is possible for women to reach these very high echelons of even the council that elects the supreme leader. Now, her position is quite extraordinary in the sense that she played a major role in family law reform in the early 2000s in Iran, and this will just be sort of the closing example before I come to my concluding remarks. You may know that between 2000 and 2004, the Iranian parliament was reform-oriented and reform-dominated. So you had a number of parliamentarians, a majority, who were really invested in improving on the rule of law, in raising the marriage age, in making divorce equal for men and women. A number, I'm just giving you now 2 examples from family law, but a number of social issues that they sought to address. The problem, of course, being that every legal reform that passes through the Iranian parliament has to be agreed on by the Council of Guardians, right, which is just a council of clerical individuals who can veto any legal reform with reference to the argument that these reforms are not compatible with Islamic law. So this is what happened. The reform-oriented parliament wanted to raise the marriage age for boys and girls from 9 and 13 years to 16 and 18, to sort of put it maybe into the context of international standards. And the Guardian Council vetoed it and said, no, we cannot raise the marriage age to 16 for girls and 18 for boys. This is contrary to Islamic law. Girls and boys reach maturity much earlier, and we cannot justify it. It's not possible. So the reformist parliament consulted with a number of scholars, and eventually the case was forwarded to a third council, the Council of Expediency. And this Council of Expediency, that is like a mediating council between the parliament and the Guardian Council, had this brilliant idea to consult with one of these female scholars, right? Because Iran has the female scholars. They're very, very rarely consulted in the parliamentary process. And they knew that she's rather conservative. So they were very, very strategic in asking her for a fatwa. And she did. She wrote that, yes, indeed, 16 and 18 years is not compatible with any legal standards in Jafari fiqh and 12 Shi'i fiqh. But we can raise it to 13 and 15 under the following circumstances and with the following justifications. So this was her recommendation, and the Council of Expediency accepted her recommendation, and this indeed became the law. So it was her fatwa that in the end became a law. And it highlights on the one hand that women can be involved in this very important process, but it also highlights that, of course, politicians are very strategic. They knew that she is a rather conservative figure. They could have asked other women or men who have much more reformist and more forward-looking ideas on this question, and they decided to consult her. So I want to close with highlighting 5 points. The one is that, yes, in judiciaries in general in the Muslim world, women's involvement is on the rise. They are increasingly appointed as judges and also are slowly rising through the ranks from the lower, the first-tier courts to the higher courts. There's, however, huge variation, even within the Arab world alone. Very few judges in the United Arab Emirates. They're much more accepted in Egypt, by contrast. You will find an even higher number among the Southeast Asian Muslim countries. There's still substantial resistance for women judges in the Islamic judiciary, so not speaking about the general judiciary, but the Islamic judiciary. Again, it's only those 5 countries I told you about where women can actually be judges applying Islamic law. But it's also partly due to the fact that there's very little understanding of the historic role that women played as female jurists and as authoritative scholars of Islamic law. Again, I can't underline to you enough how surprised many publics react when they realize that major male scholars, Ibn Asakir, Al-Suyuti, Ibn Hajar, invoked women as their teachers. Many people are not familiar with the fact that these scholars also studied with women. Now, we know what the Islamic schools of law say about whether women can function as muftis or qadis. I showed you what the Sunni and the Shia schools say about it, but interestingly enough, there's very little correlation. So most of the judges in the Islamic tradition are from the Shafi'i world, from Southeast Asia, even though we saw earlier that actually the Hanafi school is the one that is most permissive to the role of judges. So you will find little correlation between what the schools of Islamic law say on the one hand and the empirical occurrence of women functioning as judges on the other. And we have no female judges in the Shi'i world at all, even though they are accepted as mujtahids, as these great scholars who can issue fatwas and whose fatwas are invoked in court proceedings and in parliament. So what we need, I think, is more comparative research to understand better when and why women are allowed to fulfill these roles and what kind of roles they are allowed to fulfill. And this is what Devin Stewart and I try to do in our book on women in the Shi'i world. And I think it reminds us of something that one of our fellows who isn't here today, Sheikh Ndaya, said in his talk, is it really is very often the case that culture trumps Islamic law, right? Culture often trumps religion. You find the understanding of Islamic law on the one hand, but socio-cultural contexts often make for very, very uneven application of Islamic law, and we always have to bear that in mind rather than going to strict textual analyses and assuming that therefore this is the legal situation in the Muslim world today. Thank you.